Chapter 2. The Esoteric Tradition in Germany. Europe is with child, and will bring forth a strong child, who shall stand in need of a great Godfather's gift. So reads one of the prophetic utterances in the Fama Fraternatis. And if Europe was to bring forth a child, there was no doubt that Germany was to be the womb. For in the 16th and 17th centuries, Germany was the great focal point in Europe of messianic and millennialist ideas. German thinkers had taken up the esoteric tradition revived by Italian scholars and created a German esotericism of special force, building on native mystical roots that had existed before the Italian influence was felt. Wolfram von Eschenbach's great Arthurian poem, Parzival, was written in the 1190s, contains a number of features that are startlingly reminiscent of the story presented in the Rosicrucian manifestos over 400 years later. The brotherhood of knights described in the story, who guard the Holy Grail, live in a castle called Monselveeschk, whose whereabouts are secret. This Grail brotherhood trains men and women for the service of humankind. The men go forth incognito, the women openly. The knights themselves are celibate, apart from the Grail King, who has the right to marry a woman chosen by God. The Grail which they guard is described by Wolfram as a stone left on earth by a host of angels whose wondrous properties include the capacity to heal and rejuvenate. This altruistic and idealistic brotherhood, with its celibate knights, its secret abode, and its incognito male emissaries, is paralleled by the Rosicrucian brotherhood described in the Fama and Confessio. Moreover, the description of the Grail as a stone reminds us of the passage in The Chemical Wedding which says, "At that time, the Virgin declared to us that we were knights of the golden stone." Another point of similarity lies in the many astrological references that exist in Parzival and in The Chemical Wedding. Flegitanus, the original author of the Grail story, according to Wolfram, is said to have seen with his own eyes in the constellations things he was shy to talk about, hidden mysteries. He said there was a thing called the Grail, whose name he had read clearly in the constellations. Later, Kundry, the sorceress, says to Parzival, "Whatever the planets' orbits bound, upon whatever their light is shed, that is destined as your goal to reach and achieve." Similarly, in The Chemical Wedding, there are many references to planets and signs of the zodiac. In a further striking parallel passage, Wolfram relates how, after the Grail had been taken away by maidens, Parzival gazed after them and saw, before they closed the door behind them, on a couch in an outer room, the most beautiful old man he had ever beheld. I say it, and do not exaggerate. He was grayer even than mist. This is Titurel, the founder of the Brotherhood, who remains in a kind of eternal mystical state between life and death, but able to communicate with the knights. In a similar way, the body of Christian Rosicrucians, when found by his followers in the vault, was whole and unconsumed. The idea of a monarch or leader who is not dead but asleep and will one day awaken is a familiar one. It was applied not only to King Arthur, but also to such historical figures as Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa. In Rosicrucian legend, it is the Brotherhood which reawakens, while its founder, although ostensibly dead, remains undecayed as a symbol of his abiding influence through his followers. Another ingredient in the fertile German soil from which Rosicrucianism sprang was the work of a number of great contemplative mystics. One of the most outstanding of these was Meister Johannes Eckhart, circa 1260 to 1327, a member of the Dominican order who, in his writings and sermons, taught a mystical pantheism which caused him to be arraigned for heresy. 2 years after his death. His works were condemned by Pope John XXII, but they continued to exercise an influence on later religious mysticism and speculative philosophy. Eckhart talked in terms of an identity with God. This became a point of dispute among his followers, especially between Johannes Tauler, circa 1300 to 1360, and Johannes Rosicrucians, 1293 to 1381. Tauler, whose writings later influenced Luther, agreed with Eckhart, whereas Rosicrucians preferred to think in terms of relationship with God. Another follower of Eckhart was the Dominican Heinrich Suso, or Seuss, author of Das Buchlein der ewigen Weisheit, the Book of Eternal Wisdom. The last great representative of medieval German mysticism was Nicholas of Cusa, circa 1401 to 1464, who became a cardinal and papal legate to Constantinople. In science, Cusa was ahead of his time and taught, for example, that the earth went around the sun. In his Die Vision Dei of the Vision of God, published in 1454, he compares the eyes of God to those of a face in a painting which, when observed by several observers at different angles, appear to be gazing directly at each one. He also taught the doctrine of the microcosm. When the Hermetic Kabbalistic Neoplatonic tradition reached Germany, therefore, it fell on ripe soil. One of the greatest German Hebraists and Kabbalists was Johannes Reuchlin, 1455 to 1522. From Pforzheim in the Black Forest, Reuchlin drew his knowledge of the Kabbalah to a large extent from Pico della Mirandola and from two Jewish teachers, Abadea Sforno and Jacob Lones. He also leaned heavily on the writings of Joseph ben Abraham Gittatila, a Spanish Kabbalist who wrote at the end of the 13th century and taught that divine power emanates in a series of permutations of the holy name YHWH. Reuchlin's most influential Kabbalistic work was his De Art Kabbalistica, 1517. He also wrote a book on the Hebrew language, Rudimenta Hebraica, 1506. Reuchlin's Hebrew sympathies provoked strong hostility from opponents of the Jews, especially from a fanatical convert from Judaism, Johannes Pfefferkorn. The humanists came to the aid of Reuchlin and attacked his clerical opponents in a series of satirical writings, thus striking an important blow against intolerance. Another German, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Netzheim, 1486 to 1533, was one of the most influential figures in the whole history of occultism. Born at Cologne as Heinrich Cornelis, which he later Latinized to Cornelius, adding the name of the Roman founder of Cologne, the von Netzheim, refers to a place near Cologne. Agrippa passed most of his life as a soldier and envoy in the service of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V. He led a roving life during which he pursued wide-ranging scholarship and came into contact with many leading minds in different parts of Europe. He lectured on Reuchlin in Dole, stayed with the English philosopher Dean Colet in London, and worked as physician to Queen Louisa of Savoy. His outspokenness got him into trouble with the church and with King Francois I, who had him thrown into prison at Lyon. Shortly after his release, he died in poverty. Agrippa was one of the main exponents of Ficino's Neoplatonic school of thought. This and other elements went into his main work, De Occulta Philosophia, first published at Cologne in 1531. The work consisted of 3 parts, each part examining one of the 3 realms, the elemental, the intellectual, and the celestial. The first contains a survey of natural magic. The second deals with number symbolism, and the third, which owes much to Reuchlin, treats of the divine names. One of the things that brought Agrippa fame and notoriety was his defense of magic, defined as the wisdom of the Magi, and not as the sorcery of the popular imagination. In his De Occulta Philosophia, he writes, "A magician doth not amongst learned men signify a sorcerer, or one that is superstitious or devilish, but a wise man, a priest, a prophet, and that the Sibyls were magicianesses, and therefore prophesied most clearly of Christ, and the magicians, as wise men, by the most wonderful secrets of the world, knew Christ, the author of the world, to be born, and came first of all to worship him, and that the name of magic was received by philosophers, commended by divines, and is not unacceptable to the gospel." Agrippa supported the idea of man as microcosm, seeing man as the most beautiful and perfectest work of God, and his image, and also the lesser world. Therefore he, by a more perfect composition, and sweet harmony, and more sublime dignity, doth contain and maintain in himself all numbers, measures, weights, motions, elements, and all other things which are of his composition. The third book outlines a system of Christian Kabbalism, discussing the Hebrew names of God, the Sephiroth, the angelic hierarchies, and the heavenly spheres. Agrippa also treats of the areas of influence of the planets, and the numerical values of the Hebrew letters and their Kabbalistic meanings. The next important figure in a chronological history of German esotericism is Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus, 1493 to 1541. Alchemist, physician, and occult philosopher. He was born of Swabian ancestry at Einsiedeln in Switzerland and went to Basel University at age 16, where he studied alchemy and chemistry under Trithemius, Bishop of Wurzburg. Trithemius, also an important figure in the esoteric tradition, was the author of a number of works on magic, alchemy, and prophecy. After leaving the university, Paracelsus learned about the properties of metals and minerals during a sojourn in the mountains of Tyrol. Subsequently, he pursued the life of a wandering physician, never remaining long in one place because his outspoken and aggressive nature invariably aroused enmity. He acquired vast learning over many fields, and his extensive writings range over alchemy, cosmology, medicine, and mysticism. In medicine, Paracelsus taught that the body and soul are joined and that the physician must therefore treat the two simultaneously and try to bring them into harmony. To live harmoniously, he maintained, is to live according to one's own true self. But since humans are microcosms of a larger reality, this self is conditioned by influences in the cosmos. Therefore, if the physician is to know a person thoroughly, he must be able to study the cosmic influences active upon him through astrology. He must also be a theologian to understand the needs of the soul, an alchemist to comprehend the inner workings of matter, and a mystic to know that there is a divine truth beyond reason. Paracelsus's impact on medical learning was immense. Among his practical achievements was the classification of miners' diseases based on his experiences in the Tyrolean mine. He was also a pioneer of systematic laboratory techniques. Paracelsus's thought was imbued with Ficinian, Hermetic, and Kabbalistic ideas. For the Kabbalah, he wrote, opens up access to the occult, to the mysteries. It enables us to read sealed epistles and books, and likewise the inner nature of men. For the Kabbalah builds on a true foundation. Pray, and it will be given to you. Knock, and you will be heard. You will gain greater knowledge than Solomon. Paracelsus's writing had a great influence on the occult thinkers who followed him. Among them, Valentin Weigel, 1533 to 1588, a Protestant pastor whose mystical writings brought him into disfavor with the co-religionists, and Aegadius Gutmann, 1490 to 1584, author of Offenbarung Gottlicher Majestat, the Revelation of Divine Majesty, which gives an esoteric interpretation of Genesis and stresses the spiritual side of alchemy. Throughout European, and particularly German history, religious and social upheavals have gone hand in hand. Thus, the state of German and European society during the pre-Rosicrucian era and the attitudes of mind which it engendered played as important a role in shaping the Rosicrucian movement as did its intellectual background. In his remarkable book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, Professor Norman Cohn cites many examples of revolutionary sects and self-appointed messiahs who rebelled against the established religious and secular order and foreshadowed Luther's Reformation. One of the most important pre-Lutheran Reformation movements was that of the Bohemian Brethren, followers of John Hughes, or Huss, circa 1373 to 1415. Although its founder was burned for heresy, the Hussite movement continued to flourish in Bohemia right up to the 30 Years' War, and still has followers today. It was not until Luther's time, however, that the Reformation became a widespread and serious challenge to the Roman Church. The revolution that began with Luther's nailing his 95 Theses against the abuse of indulgences to the door of the castle church at Wittenberg in 1517 led to a long and bitter series of conflicts between supporters of the old and new orders, conflicts which were usually bound up with the territorial ambitions of the princes. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was an attempt to settle the dispute, but it brought only an incomplete and temporary respite. The period between this peace and the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618 was a time of continuing confrontation and skirmishing between Catholic and Protestant. The German world in particular, with its many principalities ranged on both sides of the issue, suffered dislocations. One of the ways in which people often seek consolation in times of trouble is by believing that their sufferings are part of a pattern of history and that a new golden age is just around the corner. This notion was at the center of a complex of thought current during the post-Reformation period in Germany, which has come to be called Pansophism, from the Greek pansophia, meaning universal knowledge. People who thought in this manner owed a great deal to the writings of 12th century Italian abbot and mystic Joachim of Fiore, circa 1135 to 1202, who invented a prophetic system which Norman Cohn calls the most influential known to Europe until the appearance of Marxism. After a long period spent in contemplating the scriptures, Joachim received an inspiration which seemed to reveal a predictive message contained in the Bible. Joachim saw history as a process taking place in 3 successive ages, each presided over by one of the 3 persons of the Trinity. First came the age of the Father, characterized by the rule of law. Second came the age of the Son, with the emphasis on the gospel and on faith. And finally would come to the age of the Holy Spirit, or Paraclete, an age of love, joy, and freedom, when knowledge of God would be revealed directly in the hearts of all humankind. This idea continued to echo many centuries after Joachim's death. Joachim conceived of each age as lasting for 42 generations, each generation consisting of 30 years. Since the second age began with the birth of Christ, it followed that the third age would begin in 1260. Meanwhile, the way must be paved for the advent of the new age, and this would be achieved by a new order of monks who would preach the gospel throughout the world. One of these would be a supreme teacher whose task it would be to teach the world to turn away from earthly things and toward the things of the Spirit. For 3.5 years before the Third Age finally came, however, there would be a period of purging carried out by the Antichrist, a secular king who would destroy the corrupt and worldly church to make room for the true church. The Antichrist, in his turn, would be overthrown and the age of the Spirit would begin. The Antichrist, in his turn, would be overthrown and the age of the Spirit would begin. Around the beginning of the 17th century, many people predicted that the time of the Antichrist Antichrist was near. One of them was Heinrich Vogel, a Protestant pastor of Lutzelstein, author of Offenbarung der Geheimnissen der Alchemy, Revelation of the Secrets of Alchemy, published in 1605. In this work, Vogel writes that when the gospel and alchemy came forth again together, the Antichrist would be revealed, and the last day would be near. An omen of this was the emergence of certain philosophers, such as Paracelsus, who brought alchemy out of the darkness and purified it. There were also certain people who saw themselves as founders of Joachim's new order. Julius Sperber, who later became a Rosicrucian apologist, wrote in his Wonderbook, Book of Wonders, of a visionary dream in which he saw the words Niterum ardentum deglutium, I shall disgorge the glowing brightness. On waking, he consulted the scriptures and found the passage about the prophet Isaiah's mouth being touched by a seraph with a glowing coal, signifying that he was to go forth in prophecy. Will Eric Pukert summarizes Sperber's interpretation of this experience. The third age is approaching, whose beginning is concealed to the world, except for a few individuals. The most important evidence for this is that in the years between 1500 and 1600, the world has had the same aspect as in the century preceding the birth of Christ. And just as then, only a few people were aware of the coming new age, such as the shepherds in the field and the priest Zacharias, although it had been announcing itself for a long time. So the beginning of this new golden age is known only to a few. But those who can see are able to discern the signs. Everywhere changes are visible. Luther has reformed religion. Nicholas Vigilis, Latinized from Weigel, has proposed a new legal system for the Roman Empire. In medicine, Paracelsus had come forward 60 years previously, and in philosophy, Ramus and Guillaume Postel have created a new system. Also in law, there has been a change. A medical man, Johannes Johann Weir, the well-known opponent of witchcraft persecution, has stood up and said that belief in witchcraft is foolishness. Sperber goes on to describe the new age. The new Jerusalem will emerge, he claims, and a new religion will come into being, presided over by the Holy Spirit. Everyone's eyes will be opened, belief will grow strong, and unbelief fade. The true, complete philosophy will be grounded on true theology. As the first age was ruled by monarchy, and the second by aristocracy, so the third age will be one of democracy. The new medicine will be spagoric, that is, alchemical, and the 7 liberal arts will flourish. Sperber could also have mentioned other areas in which the world was undergoing profound change. Galileo had brought his telescope to bear on the surface of the moon. Copernicus had introduced the concept of the heliocentric planetary system. The Americas had been discovered. The globe had been circumnavigated. Everywhere a great expansion of horizons was taking place. In this atmosphere, there were those who sensed that humankind was facing an opportunity to create a different kind of vision, embracing both the wisdom of the past and the new perspectives that were opening up. This sense would be expressed in the opening paragraph of the Fama, which states that God has recently made manifest unto us many wonderful and never heretofore seen works and creatures of nature, and moreover hath raised men imbued with great wisdom, who might partly renew and reduce all arts, in this our age spotted and imperfect, to perfection, so that man might thereby understand his own nobleness and worth. Many ingredients, therefore, went into creating the expectation of a new age. Joachim's crucial year of 1260 had, of course, to be revised, and opinions differed as to when the new age would begin. Adam Nachenmoser, in his Prognosticum Theologicum, 1588, counted the 1260 years from the death of Constantine in 327, arriving at the year 1587 as the crucial moment. From then on until 1600, he predicted, the labor pains would last. That is, the Antichrist would reign. But in 1600, the new age would be born. Nachenmoser, like Sperber, brings in the widespread idea that the Antichrist would be opposed by a third Elias, or third Elijah. At the end of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, the following verse occurs: "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." King James, Malachi 4:5. John the Baptist was held to be the second Elias, but the third age also had to have its Elias, and his identity was the subject of much speculation. Paracelsus had also written about this theme. In chapter 8 of his Buch von den Mineralen, Book of Minerals, he says, "That which is of lesser importance God has already allowed to be revealed, but the more important is still in the dark, and will remain so until Elias the artist comes." This Elias the artist was conceived of Paracelsus as an adept of chemical science. This revealer, he said, would come 58 years after his death. As Paracelsus died in 1541, that would mean that Elias would appear in 1599. But certain people argued that Paracelsus had, in fact, died in 1544. Hence, 1603 became the crucial year. In the Fama Fraternatus, one more year is added to the figure, and 1604 is given as the date when Christian Rosicrucians' tomb was opened. But there is no doubt that Joachim's idea of a new order to prepare for the coming Third Age was in the mind of the author or authors of the Fama. Perhaps the most important prophetic writer in relation to the Rosicrucian question was Simon Studian. This mystic and theosophist was born at Urach, Württemberg, in 1543, and received his master's degree at Tübingen in 1565. Later, he worked as a tutor in Marbach and Ludwigsburg. He was, for a time, patronized by Friedrich, Duke of Württemberg, an enthusiastic promoter of occult studies, but Studian's unorthodox views brought him enemies who conspired to remove him from Friedrich's favor. His most important work, Nametria, never appeared in print, but must have circulated widely in manuscript. The word naos is Greek for temple, and the title of the book means the measurement of the temple. That is to say, the inner and outer temple, which represent Holy Writ and nature. In the work, Studian leans heavily on Joachim. According to Studian, the penultimate of Joachim's prophetic generations before the beginning of the New Age lasted from 1560 to 1590. The next, therefore, extends to 1620. Moreover, the New Age as envisaged by Studian would be designated by a cross. One of the many illustrations in Nametria shows a female figure representing the New Age riding forth on a creature made up of the four animals of Ezekiel's vision and carrying a banner with a cross on it. She rides on firm ground, while to the left the Pope and the Emperor cling to a ship foundering on rocks. Studian identified Joachim's new order with an organization which he calls the Confederatio Militae Evangelicae, a kind of Protestant alliance concluded at Lüneburg in 1586 between certain princes, electors, and representatives of the King of Navarre, the King of Denmark, and the Queen of England. Another of the participants was Friedrich, Duke of Württemberg, to whom the Nametria is dedicated, and who is referred to as the crucifier of the final pope. Whether such an alliance ever existed is open to doubt, but it is possible that the idea of it foreshadowed the notion of the Rosicrucian fraternity. I shall return later to the links between the Nametria and the Rosicrucian manifestos. It is significant that the Nametria is dated 1604, for this is not only the supposed date of the opening of Christian Rosicrucians' tomb, but also a significant year astrologically. That year saw the appearance of two new stars in the constellation Serpentarius of Cygnus. At the time when the new stars appeared, Jupiter and Saturn were in conjunction in the 9th house. As Jupiter was considered a good planet and Saturn a bad one, there was some speculation as to which was dominant. The general consensus, however, was that, as the 9th house is Jupiter's house, and Jupiter rules Pisces, the sign which was in the ascendant at the time of observation, Jupiter was the dominant planet. Both planets were also favorably placed in relation to the outer planets. When Saturn is well placed, it brings forth thoughtful, serious men. The combination, therefore, promised the advent of a prophet or prophets who would be wise, just, and righteous. It was believed, moreover, that these astrological positions corresponded to the positions present at the creation. According to traditions, the sun first appeared on the 4th day of creation, when Aries was in the ascendant. From this it followed that Sagittarius must have been in the 9th house. Thus, the signs at the appearance of the new stars in 1604 were the same as those for the beginning of the world, proving that 1604 would also see a great new beginning. In the Rosicrucian context, this new beginning meant the opening of Christian Rosicrucians' tomb and the issuing forth of his message. These key issues and intellectual currents which lay behind the emergence of the Rosicrucian movement helped to explain both the excitement with which the movement was greeted in some quarters and the vehemence with which it was opposed in others.